Okay, so I've just covered my test practice studies with a piece of printer paper, so I'm not looking at it and we can get a clear view. So I had cropped my photo of my two textures to be almost a square, and I haven't like done the proportions exactly, but I've just taped up my canvas here to give me two kind of squares, and I'll just be working on one. I also kind of liked what happened here is there's this little space that I can test out paint on, which is always nice to have. Sometimes if you see artist studies and practice paintings, they'll have, you know, little test of paintbrush splotches all over the side of their painting, which I always think is fun to look at. So this little area kind of makes me happy to have it to work on. Okay, the first thing I'm gonna do is just draw on my canvas with a regular old pencil. This is an HB pencil, which is like the number 2 pencils you get. And I'm just gonna get in the big shapes and the quick outlines of my composition. So I'm thinking about this triangle shape here. I hope that noise doesn't bother anybody. And then there's another triangle shape where we have the sort of second texture. So I have like my wood, old, you know, wood tree bark here that's dying and decaying tree bark. And then I have some like gravelly stuff here with old dead leaves, which all this old dead stuff is kind of my favorite thing to paint. And then I actually didn't notice this until I painted it a couple times, but there's this kind of cool overhang of bark hanging down here that I want to incorporate. There's another piece coming off. So there's these like, all right, and that is like basically what I'll draw. You don't have to do this step. I just sometimes like to do it because it gives me a sort of outline to get everything in place. And we're gonna do sort of 2 underpainting layers. So these underpainting techniques artists have developed over centuries, and you know, there's no right or wrong way to do it. People will try to get to the exact formula that Rembrandt or Michelangelo used, and you know, we're not working with those same materials, and if those guys were alive today, they'd probably use more updated stuff too. They wouldn't be, you know, taking the time to mix all those unhealthy things to breathe in. So I say just use what you have and find a way that works for you. That's what these studies are good about, to like try different things and see what works for you. So we're gonna do 1 color underpainting and we're gonna wipe out the highlights. So I usually use something like a raw umber, but if you just have red, yellow, and blue, the primary colors, I can show you how to mix a neutral. So we want like a warm neutral tone in the background. So I'm just going to very unscientifically plop red, yellow, and blue, the 3 primary colors, down on my palette and mix them up to get a neutral tone. So different amounts of the red, different amounts of the yellow will give you different like browns and neutrals, and you can get to black that way. You know, you can, if you like to do things in a scientific way, you can really figure out the measurements. But for this underpainting is going to pretty much get covered up. So what we're really doing is just establishing the composition and the values quickly. So we're quickly filling the canvas with paint. So we're not staring at a blank canvas, and we're getting down the values, the darks and lights, and the basic composition very quickly. Okay, so next step, once you have your paint, you can use the raw umber or you can mix red, yellow, blue. I have old rags here. This was like an old sleeve of a t-shirt. You can add the glazing liquid or water. So we want to thin out the paint, but not as much as a wash. So a wash is like really watery, kind of dripping, and this is more transparent, but it has more of a body of a thickness to it that we can really see. And let me wipe that off before. I have a bad habit of letting paint dry on my palette knives. You can obviously be mixing yours with a brush too. Okay, I'm gonna get my brush wet in just regular water. So I'm really using water and the, and you can see that's a pretty red brown, a warm brown, which I'm actually fine with because I think that will look nice if any of it is showing through. You know, I could add more blue to it if I wanted to make it less purpley, but I'm gonna go with this. So I'm getting it watery, I'm testing up here in my test, and then I'm in my test area, and then I'm just filling my whole canvas up with this paint. So you can see it's thin and sort of transparent, but it's not as watery as a wash. And leave the brush strokes, make it brushy. If you have an old crappy brush, use the old crappy brush. These are already, we're starting to have some texture with the brush strokes. My pencil lines are almost gone for me, so I'm sure you can't see them on the video, but I'm also looking at my reference, so I'm not too worried about that. Might add a little more just to fill the whole surface. That got too wet, and see, now it's picking up, so I went too far. There we go. I'm gonna clean that off and just leave it over here. And so now I have a cloth, so you could use a cloth, you could use a paper towel. You might also want to grab some Q-tips for details. And what I'm doing is I kind of just wrap the cloth around my finger and I'm wiping out the highlights. So this is where the light is really hitting. And I'm just thinking about the big shapes of highlight and shadow. And I'm wiping out that whole area is in highlight. And I want to get this sort of triangle where the rocks are is also in highlight. And if it stops wiping, I just move to another part of my cloth here and continue wiping. And you can even get some like details, you know, this edge is rocky, so I'm kind of making like circles. And already we're getting some texture in here. And then I have this area, need a new part of my cloth, this area where this weird shape is hanging down. And you see when I get a new piece of my cloth, I'm able to pull more paint up. And I'm just getting the basic shape. This is not about details. This is about composition and value. So I'm going to take even more paint off here. The nice thing about using the glazing liquid is that it extends the drying time of your paint. So it will take longer for the paint to dry, which is helpful because it makes it maybe a little bit more like oil paint. Now I'm just kind of dabbing in here to get a little more texture, and there's some highlight areas in here. So I'm thinking about my overall composition, where the lightest parts are and where the darkest parts are, and trying to get some of, I use these old t-shirts that have been washed, you know, hundreds of times, because they don't have as much lint on them, where when you use paper towels, you might notice, even though I buy these special paper towels that aren't supposed to have a lot of lint, they can leave a lot on the surface. If you want to get more detailed, you can use a Q-tip. Sometimes I dip it in some water, and I can come in here and I'll kind of wet that area if it's drying a little bit, and then use the other side of the Q-tip. This is why Q-tips are great for painting. If you ever do watercolor, you know that as well. Because you can have one side that's wet and one side that's dry, and you can see how much using the wet side of the Q-tip then the dry side of the Q-tip really takes off a lot of paint here. And I think I want to make sure to get this area where the light is hitting is like the lightest, some of the lightest area of my painting. So I'm going in a different direction because the texture is kind of going in that direction. Let's make sure we get all this off. Okay, so that's the first layer of the underpainting. You're quickly getting some paint down on the canvas, so it's no blank canvas syndrome. You're wiping out the lights, and you're starting to already get some textures in here with either a cloth or a paper towel or the Q-tip. And then we're gonna let this dry and then do a second underpainting layer that's gonna add more detail.